Great to be here this afternoon. I'm currently in the middle of working with some guys on some advanced NetScaler topics this week. And so a couple of them are joining us on the webinar. So a shout out to them for loaning me a little bit of their time. And it fits right in with what we're talking about in that particular class with the policy engine. And so what we've got is the NetScaler and all sorts of really neat things that we can go in and do thanks to what we call the policy engine. And so we're going to go in and take a look at the policy engines. We're going to go in and talk about a couple of different features that use the policy engines and some of the neat use cases that kind of go along with them. And so we'll be going in and talking about Responder. We'll talk a little bit about some of the cool things that we can do with Responder in general, and then a little bit of some of the advanced stuff that you can do from the security side in terms of protecting the back end from certain traffic that's trying to come in and do something malicious. We'll also go in and talk about another neat feature, which is called Rewrite, which uses the policy engine for modifying traffic. And so we'll go in and be able to take a look at that. Taken together, Rewrite and Responder, probably two of the most powerful features on the NetScaler, really because they give us the ability to use the policy engine and control what traffic gets through the NetScaler or how it gets through. We'll also probably get to take a look at content switching, a little bit of that functionality. Most people are buying a NetScaler because it does load balancing. The second most used feature on the NetScaler is going to be content switching. It is a policy-driven feature and really lets us do some neat stuff. So we'll jump right in. I'll cover a few basic concepts and everything, and then I'll go in and supplement this with some cool demos so you can see this stuff in action. So the big thing is AppExpert. And so AppExpert is kind of the marketing term for policies. So if you're looking at the GUI of the NetScaler, you've got the system node, and right underneath it, you've got AppExpert. And what AppExpert is kind of the marketing term for policies. And so you get the AppExpert policy engine. And what that means is we use policy engines to identify interesting traffic. Okay? Now, I go in and say interesting traffic, and we'll talk about kind of what that is here in a minute. But the idea is we use a policy engine to identify interesting traffic, and then we've got all sorts of different features on the NetScaler that can do things with interesting traffic. Okay? If you need me to just throw out a couple of them, we've got features related to caching and compression. We've got, obviously, Rewrite and Responder. I mentioned content switching. Okay? And so there's a lot of different features that can go in and do things with this interesting traffic. So we use the policy engine to identify interesting traffic. Okay? Now, we've got two policy engines on the NetScaler. Okay? Now, some people say, well, that kind of creates some confusion, and I can kind of see that. The general idea is the policy engine is going to identify interesting traffic, but there's a couple different ways that might happen. Okay? And so you've got what's called the classic policy engine, and really it's classic because it's been around forever. So if you go in and look at the NetScaler over time, we've had the classic policy engine, we've had features that use the classic policy engine, and they do neat things for the NetScaler. Okay? Unfortunately, this policy engine is designed for web traffic. So it's designed to look at web traffic as pretty much the only protocol. And it's designed to look at basic information. So it can look at the URL, it can look at headers, and that's about it. Okay? So over time, as they wanted to make the NetScaler more powerful, they obviously needed to overcome those two limitations. So they came out with what's called the Advanced Policy Engine. And the Advanced Policy Engine basically addresses those two issues. One, we need to be able to look at more than just web traffic. So the Advanced Policy Engine knows how to identify interesting traffic with DNS, SQL, and other protocols. Okay? And it can look at more than just header information. It can actually look in the body content. And so this goes in and gives us a broader scope of what we can define as interesting. Now, it also brings about a whole slew of other tools for how we go in and identify interesting traffic. So the ability to take a URL apart, look at strings, before string, after string, use regex, various things of that nature. So it's a much more powerful tool set. And if you look at the NetScaler over time, the big differences between version 8, version 9, version 10, it's been a migration of features from classic engine to advanced engine. So now in the modern era of the NetScaler, most things are going to be using the advanced policy engine. If you look at version 12 of the NetScaler, you're really going to see some of the features that have been using the classic engine really try to depart from that. So you'll go in and see things like authentication, traditionally using the classic policy engine. Now, they're going in and pushing the direction of the advanced policy engine. We're seeing that with some other features. The NetScaler Gateway, probably the biggest feature still left on the classic engine. And we're seeing a progression to move from classic to advanced. So you'll see the term default policy engine. That's really what it gets called now. And so there's a big push to move from the classic to the advanced. And so we start calling it the default policy engine. Basically, advanced and default mean the exact same thing. Okay? So how do we put together a policy? Okay? And so I've kind of outlined 4 parts to a policy. And this is going to be kind of good advice that's going to work for any feature that we want to go in and play around with. And so when you go in and create a policy, the first thing you're going to do is give this policy a name. Okay? I'm real big on having a good naming convention. So we name this policy based off of the feature that we're working with. Then we go in and work with what type of element is it. Is it a policy? Is it an action? Is it a server object? You could have some features that instead of just having simple actions, they've got a collection of settings or a collection of actions. We call it a profile. So going in and identifying the feature that we're working with and what aspect of it is really kind of important. And then going in and actually saying what this thing is going to do. And so going in and having a good naming convention for pretty much everything on the NetScaler goes a long way towards helping with the troubleshooting. Okay? The second thing that's a part of a policy is the expression. This is what the policy engine is about. We're going to go in and identify interesting traffic. Okay? Now, what makes it interesting? It could be the URL that you're requesting. The URL could equal, it could contain, something like that. Could be that we're looking for headers. And so you could have a header that exists or contains something, equals something, so on. The idea is we're identifying interesting traffic. Okay? So kind of one example that I'll throw out is we're going to go in and look at iPhones. I like going in and kind of picking on iPhones. We've actually got a neat way of demoing this in the lab. And so I could say it's interesting because you're using an iPhone. Okay? I could just as easily go after Firefox or Safari or Internet Explorer. I could go after your user agent header, basically. So I could look for what makes traffic interesting. And that is what the policy engine is about. So I use the policy engine to identify interesting traffic. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to tie that to an action. And then that action is really going to be feature dependent. So what feature are we talking about? So if we're talking about something like compression, my action is going to be compress traffic or not. If we're talking about caching, my action is going to be cache an object or not. Okay? When we get into rewrite and responder, what make those features so powerful is this action is definable. And so we can go in and say, I need to respond a certain way. I need to modify a certain way. And so we've got all sorts of neat things that we can do based off of the different features. So we create a policy by identifying interesting traffic and then specifying what we want to have happen with it. Okay? And then the last part of this is the binding. And so what you're going to do is you're going to go in and bind this policy to have it take effect. And what that's going to do is it's going to affect the scope of the policy. So for instance, we can create a policy and we can bind it globally. What that means is it applies to all traffic coming into the NetScaler. Okay? So for instance, I said we could talk about iPhones. Let's say that we identify interesting traffic as being an iPhone, and then I've got an action that goes in and drops the request. Okay? If I bind that globally, then that kind of makes me sound like an iPhone hater. Okay? If you're using an iPhone, your connection is getting dropped. Now, maybe that's not the intention at all. Maybe I've got a virtual server that's for BlackBerry or Android. Okay? Shouldn't be for iPhone. If I bind that policy to it, then it becomes, if you use an iPhone coming into the BlackBerry specific server or Android specific server, then your request gets dropped. And so going in and controlling that binding allows us to go in and control the effect of that policy. Okay? And so we go in and we bind our policies to have them take effect, and that's going to go in and determine the scope of what's happening. Okay? So what can be interesting traffic? Okay? And I mentioned a couple different things here. We could go in and take a look at URLs. And so I could go with your URL equals something specific. Okay? So in this example, I've got here not just Google. I'm looking specifically for Google/search. If that's your URL, that could be interesting. Okay? I could go in and say it contains something. So if I see .com in there, that's interesting. And so I can go in and say I need this whole thing to equal something. Or I could say I just need this piece somewhere. So if you're going to google.com or yahoo.com or whatever.com, I can go in and say that's interesting. And so I can go in and look at your URL to make that decision. I can look at headers. Okay? Headers get used by the client to pass information about the client to the back end. They also get used by the back end to pass information about the server. And so I can go in and look to see if a header exists and say that's interesting. I can go in and look to see if a header equals something. So I've got an example here. You've got a user agent header, and it tells me what type of browser you're using. In this example, I could be looking for a Citrix receiver specifically. Okay? Those of you guys that work with XenApp and XenDesktop would know what that is. That is the tool that we use to connect to our XenApp and XenDesktop resources. And there's no mistake in it. It's going to equal Citrix receiver. There's no Citrix receiver, and then we throw in a bunch of other terminology. It equals Citrix receiver or not. Okay? And then I threw in an example here of contains. So instead of saying it equals something very specific, I could go contains iPhone. And then you've got different versions of iPhone. You've got all the different versions of iOS and things like that. Here it doesn't matter. As long as I see the word iPhone, that's interesting. And then I can build a policy off of it and go in and do something. Okay. Also, I went in and threw a little information about layers 3 and layer 4. So I could go after IP addresses. I could go after ports. And so I could go in and say I'm looking for an IP address that is specific or is between a range or is in a subnet. And so there's a couple of different things that I can do to be able to put this in place and say that's interesting traffic. Okay? So let me go in and kind of show you how the responder feature is going to work. And so what I'll do is I'll go in and kind of diagram this up, and then I'll go in and kind of show you what happens. And so here I've got a client coming in. They're going to be funneling their traffic through the NetScaler. So the basic assumption here is I've got some load balancing. So the client comes in to make a request, and it would typically get load balanced to the back end. What responder is going to do is it's going to let me look at that request and be able to determine if I want to go in and do something. And so what we would do is we would create a responder policy. And I would use this responder policy to identify interesting traffic. And then if I see interesting traffic, what I'm going to do is I'm going to tie that to a responder action. Yep. And then what I can do is I can go in and actually put in place all sorts of neat things that I want to see happen if I see interesting traffic. And so, for instance, one of the basic built-in features is I could go in and drop a request, or I could go in and reset the connection. Whoops. Okay. And so what happens is the client comes in and says, give me content. We look to see interesting traffic. And if we do, the NetScaler is going to respond. Now, it could be something as basic as dropping and resetting traffic. Okay. I could get a little bit more advanced. Instead of just dropping the request, if I need to go in and give them an explanation, I could. So I could go in and use a custom message. And so I can set up my NetScaler to hand back a custom message that renders in the browser to tell them why they're not getting their backend content. Okay? I can go in and hand out some custom HTML. So I can actually load an HTML file on the NetScaler. We call it an import. And then when you come in and identify interesting traffic, we hand out this custom page. Yep. I can also use this to do a redirect. Yep. And so it could be that you need to go somewhere else, or maybe I want to send you to a terms of services page. We identify interesting traffic, and then the action is redirect somewhere. And so I can go in and send you wherever I need to. Okay. And so I can go in and put these in place, identify interesting traffic, and then take these actions. Let me kind of show you what this would look like. So in the lab environment here, I've got a NetScaler set up. This is NetScaler version 12. And I've got some basic load balancing. So I've got load balancing in place. I've got a virtual server here. So if I come in and request content, it should load balance me to the back end. Okay? So this is basic load balancing in action. What I want to do is I want to go in and involve responder in this process. Okay? Go in and identify interesting traffic and then take some kind of an action. And so what I can do is I can come in here, and here's that AppExpert node that I mentioned earlier, and then you'll see rewrite and responder. And so with responder, you can go in and create policies, you can go in and create actions. Okay? Now, I don't have any actions built yet. What I'll do is I'll just go in and use one of the basic ones, drop a reset. Okay? So what I need to do is I need to identify interesting traffic. And so I can identify interesting traffic and then use responder to take some type of action. So what I'll do is I'll create a policy. So the first thing I mentioned was giving this thing a name. So you usually go in and create some abbreviation for your feature. So this is responder. So this would be a RSP function. This is going to be a policy, so I'm specifically going to go in and label it as such. Okay? Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off with kind of the example that I already set of talking about iPhones. Okay? So what I could do is go in and say I'm going to create a policy for dealing with iPhone traffic. Okay? And then it says what type of action would you like to take, and so I've got a couple of basic actions. I could drop the traffic, I could reset the traffic. Okay? Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to go in and use reset. The reason is, from a demo perspective, this works really well. I make the request, I get instant feedback, then I'm not getting what I asked for. Okay? If this was a real security issue, I would probably use drop, and then you'd make the request, the NetScaler would silently drop it, and then you don't have any active feedback to let the client know that there's something sitting there filtering the traffic. So it's a little bit more stealthy of a process. Okay? So responder is going to go in and take a reset action. Under what conditions? And then this is where the policy engine comes into play. I'm going to go in and identify interesting traffic. Now, I've got a couple of neat things that I can do here. What I've got is this text box. And so if I actually know what my expression is, I could go in and plug this in. If you're new to the advanced policy engine and you don't necessarily understand exactly how we're going to identify interesting traffic, there's a really valuable tool called the Visual Policy Builder. And that's over here on the right where it says Expression Editor. And what it does is it gives me what I like to call the boxes. And then the boxes make it very easy to identify the different pieces of interesting traffic. Okay? And so this goes in and says, what protocol are we working with? And so I'm going to go in and deal with some information that comes at layer 7 with web traffic. So my protocol is going to be HTTP. This would go in and be your flow type. Is this a request from the client? Is it a response from the backend server? In this case, it's going to be a request. So I'm going to be able to go in and say, I'm looking for a request from the client. And then I've got my qualifier. What part of the request are we interested in? And so I can go after body content. I can go after headers. I could go after the host name. I can go after the URL. In this case, what I'm interested in is a header. It's called the user agent header. And it tells me what type of browser they're using. If you're not familiar with what these are, I've got a neat plugin here with Firefox called Live HTTP Headers. So that as I come in and make a request, it goes in and shows me the back and forth headers. Okay? And so what I can do is I can see this request is coming from, And then you've got the user agent header telling you this is Mozilla 5.0, specifically Firefox version 47. So this is the header that I'm interested in. So I can go in and build a policy that identifies that. So I'm looking for a header. Header's called user agent. And what I'm interested in is, does that user agent header contain something? And then that something that I'm interested in is the iPhone. And so I can go in and say user agent header contains iPhone. If I see that, that's interesting. And then when I hit done, it's going to go in and plug that value down here so that you can see that this is how we would identify interesting traffic. So your user agent header contains iPhone. That's interesting. If I see it, this is the action that I want to take. And so I'd go in and put this in place. I'd come in and hit create, and I've got my policy. Now, am I doing this for anything bad against Apple or iPhone? Absolutely not. What we've got is we've got a really neat way to be able to go in and demo this. And so I've got within Firefox a plugin called the user agent switcher. And it lets me go in and adjust my user agent headers. And so it says the default. This is Firefox version 47. And you saw that when I showed you the header. What I can do is I can say, pretend to be an iPhone. Now, it's not going to go in and change the layout of the screen, but it will change that header that's being provided to the back end. So when I come in and make the request, if you look at these headers, instead of saying Firefox version 47, it's now going to say iPhone. Now, you'll see that I'm still getting my content. The reason is policies must be bound to take effect. So what I need to do is go in and bind this to have it take effect. So I've got a shortcut right here to what's called a policy manager, and it shows me my bind points. I could bind it globally. So for all traffic coming in, this is what we want to go in and do. Okay? I could also go in and say I want to bind to a specific load balancer, and then I can see the different entities that I've got. So I've got this basic load balancer, and I can say let's bind this in here. Okay? So I select my policy, obviously the one that I just created. I say put this in place. I've got what's called a priority. This is if I've got multiple things that I need to go in and look for. The priority is going to be my order of operations. Where do I look first, second, third, and so on? Okay? And so I can go in and adjust the priority if I've got multiple things going on. And so what I can do is I can go in and put this in place and hit bind. So now, if you come into this virtual server using an iPhone, this is the action that's going to take effect. Okay? And so if I jump over here to demo this, should be able to make the request, and then this is a reset. This is me coming in and asking the NetScaler for content, and the NetScaler is responding accordingly. Okay? Now, this is just a basic reset. I could go in and drop traffic. That would leave me sitting here waiting for about 30 seconds to get feedback that I'm not getting what I asked for. Okay? I can also go in and have responder do all sorts of other things. And so in terms of my actions, there's just a couple built in, drop or reset traffic, but there's also the ability to create my own action. And so I can go in and say, I need this to do whatever. And so I can come in and create a action. And what I'll do is I'll go in and say, I want to hand back a custom message. Okay. And so it says, what type of action would you like to create? And what I'll do is I'll go in and say, let's respond with. And then in the expression box, I can go in and mock up what I would like to have sent back to the client. So this can be something like HTTP 1.1. Okay. Oops. And then I can do a 200 OK. And then those are some return characters. And what that is the code to say, render this in the browser. And so that's enough headers to say, this should render in the browser. And then I can add in a custom message. Okay? And I can go in and say, you know, This device is not appropriate. Consult the terms of services. Okay? I can also use the policy engine to take apart the request and stick it into this message. So consult terms of services to access, and then I can grab the URL that they're requesting. And so this is the advanced policy engine looking at the HTTP request URL. And so I can say, grab the URL that they requested, stick it into this message. So whatever it is they come in and request, they're going to get a message telling them that they can't go in and access it. Okay? And so I can create a custom action. Okay? It doesn't like my syntax here. Helps if I go in and put that in place correctly. And then I just switch this out with the policy. So identify interesting traffic, take an action. And now I've got my own custom action. Okay? And so I can throw this in, go in and say, if you're using an iPhone, get back a custom message. And so if I come in here, make my request, I get back a custom message. And it goes in and tells me I'm trying to access the root page. Now, if I go in here and say folder 1, folder 2, file.asp, what it does is it grabs the URL that I put in the address bar and sticks it into custom message. Okay. Is this an actual directory structure that exists on the back end? No. Okay. Does that matter? No, because in this context, we're not sending anything to the back end. So the client's making a request to the NetScaler, NetScaler's taking an action, that's it. There is nothing being sent to the back end to go in and have the back end care. Okay. So I just made up a directory structure and a file. Responder stuck that into the message and send it back to the client. I can also go in and use this for a redirect. So I could go in and instead of sending back a custom message, I can go in and create a responder action to do a redirect. And so what I can do is I can go in and say, let's redirect them somewhere. And so I could plug in the URL for terms of services. Okay. I can go in and redirect them to a maintenance page or contact an administrator, whatever I want to go in and do. Okay. If I wanted to, I could go in and we're talking about mobile devices and things like that. So I could just pick a carrier and say, let's actually send you somewhere with devices. So I could say something like Verizon Wireless. And so the idea is, if you come in and have a device issue, here's where I send you. Okay? And so I put this in place, switch out my policy action. So if you're using an iPhone, you're going to get redirected. And so I put this in place. Now when the user comes in and says, give me content, what happens is they get redirected. And then you can see that it's all in fun when you go to the Verizon webpage and they're selling iPhones. Okay? So very powerful feature. Now, we can go in and use this for all sorts of different things. Doesn't necessarily have to be to go in and pick on certain device types. Okay? We can create a redirect, and we can use this for HTTP to SSL redirection. And so this is a common problem that we see in a lot of situations. So I've got a virtual server that is using SSL. And so you can come in and interact with this virtual server using HTTPS. The problem is users don't always type HTTPS. So you need a redirect to go in and move you from HTTP to SSL. Okay? Down and dirty, and there's even wizards that go in and do this. What they do is they create a virtual server that's in a down state, and then they use a property called redirect URL. And then that moves you from HTTP to SSL. We can do the exact same thing with responder. And so what we do is we create a responder action that says you need to be redirected from the HTTP URL to the SSL. So this is a responder action for HTTP to SSL. What do we want to do? And this is going to be a redirect. And then we can go in and plug in the HTTPS. So this becomes HTTPS, and then I can redirect to whatever URL I want. Okay. Or I can genericize this to the point that it'll work for anything. So I say you need to be redirected to HTTPS, and then I can grab whatever the requested hostname was. And I can use the hostname. I can also append to that the path and query. So whatever they stuck in the address bar, I can go in and say, you need to be redirected to it. Okay? There's also a component on here to sanitize this. So if the user put in something that's an unsafe character, like a space, this would stick in a hex code in our redirect. So that sanitizes the host name. This would sanitize the path and query. And so what this does is it gives me a redirect to the SSL version of whatever it is you asked for. And then I just need to create a responder policy. Doesn't make any sense to use the iPhone one here. Instead, this is about people coming in with HTTP and being able to redirect them to SSL. So the action is obviously going to be HTTP to SSL. Okay. The expression here, and then some people will go in and specify their domains, and your destination port is 80, or your destination port is not 443. They've also got a mechanism where you can come in and say you're looking at the client connection. And so there's a property for the client's SSL connection. And basically you can say the client is using SSL. And so this goes in and says if they're coming in using SSL, that is interesting. Okay? That's also not the problem. The problem is that they are not doing this. So I can throw in the exclamation point and negate this. And what it's going to do is it's going to allow me to go in, flip that around, and say if the client is not using SSL, that's interesting. And so what I can do is I can put this in place, say that they're not using SSL, they need to be redirected. Okay? And so from an efficiency standpoint, this is going to be much more efficient than relying on load balancing. Now, what we can do is we can get this to play together with this feature. So here's a virtual server listening on HTTP port 80. And what I can do is I can come in here and bind in my policy. And so I can come in and say bind in the responder policy that says redirect users from HTTP to SSL. And then what that does is it goes in and creates a scenario where the user comes in and then responder more efficiently moves them from HTTP to SSL. The other problem with this is that the virtual server is in a down state. The reason is it's not bound to anything. What I can do is I can go in and create a fake service. Just throw in any IP address. Okay. Just making this up. I can throw in an IP address, and what happens is you've got health monitoring on the back end. I can go in and say, let's not use that. And then this becomes a virtual server that is up and available always. This service doesn't get tested, always going to be up. And then when I bind that to this redirect virtual server, this virtual server will always be up. And so it's always going to be up and ready to redirect users that come in with the wrong policy or wrong protocol. Okay? And so this is a much more efficient way of going in and doing this. They've got CTX articles that explain how to go in and put that in place. It's more efficient than the down virtual server. It gets rid of the down virtual server so you don't get those SNMP alerts letting you know certain things are down. Okay? Now, we can use Responder for all sorts of really neat things. Okay? And so here you've got a very common use case where we're able to go in, identify your protocol, and redirect you. Okay? We can also go in and use this for other types of security functionalities. And so we've got situations where the user may be coming in, we might have bad IP addresses, and so kind of like a firewall functionality, we want to go in and step in. Except instead of the firewall doing a drop of traffic, we can go in and take a responder action. So we can go in and say, if you've got a bad IP address, okay, and then tie that to any of these actions. Now, where do we get these bad IP addresses? Well, we can go in and do all sorts of different things to identify that, but we can create a policy that says if your IP address equals something, let's take an action. Okay? Or we can go in and leverage some other functionality, which is called HTTP-Callout. And so what we can do is we can have an external server that maintains that database for us. So we can have a callout server, and basically the server is going to have a database of bad IP addresses. And so as a part of Responder, we can use what's called HTTP callout, and we can say pass the client's IP address to the server. And so you've got an external server maintaining your bad IP addresses. And then the callout server is going to respond, yes, you're on the database, or no, you're not. And then we can have Responder respond accordingly. If your IP address is on there, take one of these actions. If your IP address is not, then let them through. And then this makes it easy if you've got a security team managing this functionality. Instead of having to teach them how to come in and create Responder policies on the NetScaler, they can maintain this database. Your NetScaler simply uses it. Okay? I've got an example of this in the lab environment. We've actually got a server set up specifically for this. Okay? And so if I go in and interact with this server, what it does is it maintains this list of IP addresses. Okay? And so this server, just a basic web server, and it's got a script that lets me pass IP addresses and then tells me, are you on this database or not? And so I can go in and pass an IP address. And then if I pass that IP address, it says IP matched. And so I can go in and say, okay, if that IP address is on there, I need to go in and treat you a certain way. And so I can go in and structure out a Responder policy to go in and address this. And so I can come in here and create what's called an HTTP callout. I've already got this set up. It goes in, passes the client's IP address to that server, and then I can create a Responder policy that goes in and interacts with it. And so I can create a Responder policy for dealing with bad IPs. Okay. What do I want to do? And I've got all sorts of options. Okay. I can go with reset, okay, or custom message, whatever I need to. And then instead of going in and saying if the client IP is something, what I can do is I can say, let's use the callout functionality. And so I can go in and say, let's return this text, and it lets me see my callout that I created. And then I can say, if that callout returns IP matched, that's interesting. And so if I actually see this phrase, you need to be blocked. And so I can put this in place, and it gives me an expression that's going to go in and block traffic. And so from a security mechanism, I can go in and use this to be able to lock down and control various resources. And so this is the advanced policy engine being able to look at a lot more than just basic header information. Okay. Now, I want to show you some other advanced features that go along with this as well. And so there's some neat things that you can go in and do. So instead of just being limited to this callout functionality, there's actually a neat functionality of Platinum Edition NetScalers where you can get a database called an IP Reputation database. And so then instead of going in to look and see, are you on my self-maintained database, we can go in and pull down a database from a company called BrightCloud. And what BrightCloud does is they go in and do threat management for all sorts of different environments. So they build a database of bad IPs. So instead of our security team having to figure that out, we can go in and leverage this database. It's called IP Reputation. And so as a feature on the NetScaler, very easy to go in and enable it. And so you can come in and say, I want to use IP Reputation. And then the NetScaler is going to download the database maintained by BrightCloud. And then we can go in and reference that as a part of a policy. And so I can go in and say, if the client is coming in using, and then instead of going after my database, I can go in and look at the client IP, specifically their source IP. And then what I can do is I can go in and say, is malicious. And what that does is it uses that IP reputation database. If they're on it, that's interesting. Okay? And so if they're on that BrightCloud database of malicious IPs, and then we've talked about all the cool things that you can do with Responder. Now, I want to go ahead and show you another neat feature. Okay? And so I'll hop back here to the drawing board, but you've got a neat feature called Rewrite. And what Rewrite is it's about using the policy engine to identify and modify interesting traffic. And so what we're doing is we've got requests that are coming in, and we might want to go in and change them. So let's say somebody comes in and makes a request. They make a simple GET request. So it says get the root page. Well, what the NetScaler is going to do is it's going to load balance and make the request get the root page. Now, in my lab environment, the root page is kind of plain. So if I come back in here, whoops. Yep. Looks like this. Instead, I've got a much more elaborate looking home.php page. So it's a little bit more welcoming. It's got a front door, a little bit nicer. Maybe this is what I want them to have. What I can do is I can use Rewrite to be able to go in and modify that. And so I can create a rewrite policy that says if the URL equals the root page, and then my rewrite action is get home.php. And so I can go in and change this so that even though they requested this on the front end, I can go in and say, change this on the back end. And so when a user comes in, they're now going to get the nice little welcoming page with the front door, even though they requested just the root page. Now, some of you will say, well, we could change that on the back end. Sure. But if you don't, or if you can't, you can use the NetScaler to go in and fix these things. Okay? Another great example, you've got a header that gets passed from the server back to the client. It's called a server header. And it tells you what your server is. Now in the lab, I think I've got an Apache server, but it could say something like IIS 4.0. Okay? That's like a server 2000 machine. So there could be some known vulnerabilities to the server. And so if I tell the client what that server is, that could be bad. Okay? So I may want to go in and create a rewrite policy that says if server header exists, and then tie that to a rewrite action to remove it. Yep. And so then what I can do is I can protect this from the back end. If you go in and look inside the lab environment, I've got my live HTTP headers. And what they're doing is they're telling me, here's what you're getting from the back end, including a server header. The example I just used was IIS 4.0, but in the lab, you'll see this is Apache. I may not want my clients to actually see that. So what I could do is go in and use rewrite to remove that. So I create a rewrite action. Yep. And this is going to be remove the server ID. And so what type of action? And then rewrite can do all sorts of different things. In this case, I want to delete an HTTP header. What is that header called? Server header. And so I can say delete out the server header. And then I create a policy to say when. So what do I want to have happen? Obviously, remove the server header. And when, and then I've got different options. I could say when that header exists, when that header contains Apache, whatever. In this case, I can just say whenever you get back a valid response. And so if you get back a valid response, delete out the server header. And so I can create a simple policy to go in and do that. And this might be something I decide to go in and bind globally. And so I can say globally, remove the server header. And so this will let me be able to go in, set this up so that we're going to be stripping out that server header and protecting the information about what my backend servers actually are. And so this is using the rewrite functionality to accomplish that. And so if I come in here, I can make a request. And then if we look, you'll see that my response doesn't contain a server header. If I needed to, I could go in and actually stick in additional server headers. So you've got cache control. If I don't agree with how they have the cache control set up on the back end, I could delete that out, and I could go in and stick in my own cache control header. So if clients are caching stale content, I could have the NetScaler fix it and say, don't store this, okay? Or change the max age or something of that nature. And so I can go in and adjust these headers that tell the client how to treat certain things. So very, very powerful feature. Really, the sky's the limit in terms of what we can do with rewrite and responder. Okay, we got a few minutes left, so what I want to do is go in and show you one more feature. Okay, and this is going to be content switching. Okay, what content switching does is you've got load balancing. So this is your basic core concept of load balancing. You make a request, I could send you to one of these servers. Okay, what I might have is multiple arrays of these load balancers, and then I can put different content on different servers. So I could come up here and have my dynamic content. And then down here at the bottom, I could have static content. Okay? And so I've got different content behind each of these load balancers. I could come up here and have my content pages. Okay? And then down here, I could store my image files. Okay? I could actually take apart my website. So I could put the products directory up here. Okay? Down here, I could put my support directory. Okay? And so I can go in and break this apart all sorts of different ways. You could do this based off of like a language accept header. Okay? And so you've got a language accept header, which means your browser says that you prefer a certain language. So this is language accept header equals English. Down here, you could prefer Spanish. And so you can go in and actually separate this out however you need to. Here's a perfect example. How about your user agent header? So this could be mobile content. This could be your desktop browsers. And so what this does is it gives you the ability to go in and separate out these different elements. Okay? And so what I can do is I can go in and put this in place and control where different things are. So what does this have to do with content switching? Well, what we do is we throw in front of these load balancers content switching. And so this becomes a content switching vServer. And what this content switching vServer is going to do is it's going to get a VIP address. And so we'll go in and assign an IP address to it so that you can send your queries directly to it. And then we use the policy engine, exactly like I've been explaining, to identify interesting traffic. The difference is the action is, where do we send you? And so we could go in and look to see, are you requesting dynamic content? It's available up here. Are you pulling down static content? It's down here. Are you wanting content pages? They're up here. Are you wanting image files? They're down here. Are you using a mobile device? It's up here. Are you going with a desktop browser? Get your content down here. And so we can take our website apart, host specific pieces on optimized servers, and use content switching for how to go in and separate that out. And so this is a really, really powerful feature used by some really large websites. And so a lot of organizations can go in and leverage this for all sorts of different purposes. Kind of show you what this looks like. What I can do is I can come in here and create a content switching virtual server. Okay? And so I go in and create a content switching vServer. I'm going to give it an IP address like this. And so the idea is if you come in and ask this guy for content, it is a virtual server that should be able to deliver content. Okay? Now, initially, when I come in and say, give me content, it says no. And the reason is I've not created any policies. So you're asking it for content and it doesn't know where to get it. Okay? And so what you need to do is to create content switching policies. And so you identify interesting traffic and where you want to send it on the back end. And so that is the action for a content switcher, is to where it's going to send you on the back end. So what I can do is I can come in here and create a content switching policy. And let's go after mobile devices. Okay? And then you guys know we're talking about iPhones here. So this is HTTP request header. It's the user agent header. And I'm going to go with contains iPhone. And so I can plug that in. And so if I see that you're using an iPhone, that's interesting. What am I going to do? And then I can tie that to a virtual server. So I'll come in and select this red virtual server. And so I've got a couple of virtual servers. They're going to send you to one server or the other. And so you can see visually where my content comes from. Yep. So I put this in place, bind it in here. And so now if a user comes in using an iPhone, they get content. And it comes off of this red server. Doesn't really matter what it is. Yep. Whichever page is coming off of the red server. Yep. And so I can go in and identify interesting traffic and then dictate where I want to send it. Okay. I can do the same thing with different versions of Internet Explorer. So I can come in here and say I want to create a policy for some type of MSIE. Okay. And so my expression is very similar. It's going to be HTTP request. And then I'm still looking at the user agent header. Yep. And then what I'll do is I'll go after this contains MSIE. And then what you'll see is my user agent switcher tool gives me a couple different versions of Internet Explorer. And so I can come in and make requests. And when I do that, it's going to go in and have MSIE as the browser type. And so I put that in place, identifying interesting traffic, and then where I want to send it. Okay. And then as a good best practice, you want to cover all your bases. So they go in and give you a default. So I define where I want to send my traffic, and then I cover my everything else scenario. And so I can create a default and say for everything that I've not defined, and then pick a server. And so now I'm looking at your user agent header. So if you're using Internet Explorer, you go one place. If you're using Firefox, you go another place. Okay? So there's MSIE going to the blue server. If I go back to being Firefox, there's the green server. If I come back to iPhone, red server. And so it allows me to be able to go in and use the policy engine and take a part of a website and dictate where I want to send it to. Okay. This is behind load balancing, probably the second most used feature on the NetScaler. Very, very powerful tool. You'll see this by really large websites. They can go in and take apart a website by directories, and instead of having the entire website on a single web server, A, they've got load balancing to separate that out, and B, they've got content switching to send certain parts of the website to one server or load balancer of servers, optimized for that part, and to send it to a different place optimized for other content. And so we can go in and do all sorts of really neat things with this technology. What's powering it? The policy engine. And so the ability to identify interesting traffic is the same core component for rewrite, responder, content switching. We could go into compression, identify interesting traffic, and compress. How do we do that? Policy engine. Caching, same way. Okay? You can get into some other features. The gateway goes in and has its own use cases for policies, identifying interesting traffic, treated a certain way. The application firewall. This is a security feature on the NetScaler, really designed to identify interesting traffic, and then how do we want to go in and secure and protect that? Okay? And so a couple of really neat things that we can go in and do with this technology. Okay? So that's almost all the time that we have available. So I know Hannah said that you guys have got the chat window. You're welcome to put any questions in there as we went or as we wrap up. And so with that, I'll turn it back over to Hannah.